that need for connection, for support, it's still fundamental.
That's actually a really good transition. Thinking about human needs, support systems. Let's shift from the vastness of space, where maybe loneliness is the enemy, to crowded classrooms right here on Earth, where students might be facing very different kinds of barriers, systemic ones.
Yeah, it feels like a leap, but the theme of needing support and what happens when systems fail, it connects. Our sources dive into this really troubling issue in education called significant disproportionality.
Significant disproportionality, what does that mean exactly?
It's this widespread pattern where students of color, students from low-income backgrounds, and students with disabilities, they end up being identified for special education more often.
Okay.
And they're placed in more restrictive settings, and they face disciplinary action, like suspension, at much higher rates than their peers.
And the sources suggest this isn't random. It's linked to bias in the system.
That's the core argument, yeah. That bias contributes significantly to misidentification and just, well, harsher treatment for these groups of kids.
The numbers are pretty stark, aren't they?
They really are. Students of color, except for Asian students, are generally overrepresented in special ed. American Indian and Alaskan Native kids, identified at twice the overall rate.
Twice, wow.
Black students, 40% more likely to get a disability diagnosis compared to others. The risk ratios from fall 2016 IDA data show Hispanic, Black, and Native students all significantly higher than white students.
So why is this happening? The sources mentioned a couple of main viewpoints, right? Like the debate.
Kind of, yeah. One perspective is that these disparities might actually reflect higher rates of need, higher rates of disability in these groups, often linked to socioeconomic factors.
Right, poverty.
Exactly. Poverty is a big one. Kids below the poverty line are twice as likely to have specific learning disabilities. Then there's stuff like low birth weight, lead exposure, and adverse childhood experiences, ACEs. Things like, economic hardship, divorce, a parent dying or being incarcerated, violence in the home or neighborhood, mental illness or substance abuse nearby, even experiencing racial bias directly.
That's a lot.
It is. And students with 4 or more of those ACEs are 32 times more likely to have learning or behavioral challenges. So you can definitely see a link to socioeconomic stress.
But that's not the whole story, is it? There's a counter-argument about bias.
Right. Research, like from Grindle and others in 2019, shows that racial bias seems to be a factor even when you control for income.
How so?
Well, for example, they found Black students from families not considered low income were still about twice as likely to be identified with intellectual disabilities or emotional disturbances compared to white students from similar income backgrounds.
So poverty matters, but bias seems to be playing its own separate, significant role. Over into discipline, right? This whole school-to-prison pipeline idea.
Absolutely. Black, Hispanic, and Native students often get tougher punishments for the same kinds of behavior as their white peers. More office visits, more suspensions, more expulsions. Black students are 3 times more likely to be suspended or expelled. Mechanical restraint on students with disabilities. It's worrying because, as the sources note, there aren't actually federal laws strictly governing this, and restraint is supposed to be an absolute last resort.
But it seems to be used quite a lot in some settings.
It does. Data from Texas between 2007 and 2009 showed over 30,000 restraints happen in self-contained special education classrooms. Compare that to only about 2,300 in mainstream classrooms.
Big difference.
Huge. An autistic student in Texas during that time was 25 times more likely to be restrained if they were in a self-contained classroom.
25 times. That raises serious questions.
Yeah.
And it can be dangerous.
Terribly dangerous. The GAO, the Government Accountability Office, found back in 2009 that improper restraint, especially face-down holds, led to injuries, even deaths.
Oh my God.
And part of the problem is the definition of abuse in schools can be murky, things a teacher might do. Our sources mentioned an example like forcing kids to put vinegar-soaked cotton balls in their mouths. Might not legally count as abuse under education code, even if it sounds like child abuse in any other context.
That's disturbing. And the long-term impact of just kicking kids out of school.
It's devastating. It doesn't fix behavior. It just leads to kids being held back, dropping out, ending up in the juvenile justice system. That's the pipeline.
So what's the way forward? What do the sources recommend?
Well, first off, enforcement. The U.S. Department of Education needs to actually enforce the equity in IDEA regulations. A federal court ordered them to take effect immediately back in March 2019 after they'd been delayed.
Okay, enforcement first. What else?
Improving the whole process for deciding if a student needs special ed. making it more objective. That means getting outside experts who understand linguistic and cultural differences, checking policies for bias, really working with families.
Right. And supporting the whole child.
Yeah, training educators in better approaches. Things like multi-tiered systems of supports, MTSS, Universal Design for Learning, UDL, positive behavioral interventions and supports, PBIS.
Lots of acronyms.
Yeah, but they represent real frameworks. Also, culturally responsive teaching, CRT, and restorative practices. They're all designed to create better, more inclusive learning environments.
And there's legislation being proposed, too.
Yes. Things like the Counseling Not Criminalization in Schools Act, shifting funds from school police to counselors, social workers, the Keeping All Students Safe Act, trying to ban seclusion and most restraints, and the Pujak Act, specifically looking at unfair discipline for girls of color.
And finally, teacher diversity.
Crucial. The sources really emphasize this. More diverse teachers correlates with fewer discipline problems, especially for Black male students who have Black teachers.
But the workforce isn't very diverse now.
Not really. In 2017-18, about 79% of K-12 teachers were white. So yeah, there's a big gap.
One other thing mentioned was cameras in classrooms, as maybe a short-term fix.
Yeah, particularly in classrooms for students with autism. The idea is it could provide some safety for students, but also protect teachers from false accusations.
But there are privacy concerns, legal issues.
Definitely. Questions around FERPA, federal privacy laws, Justice Department guidelines on where surveillance is okay. But, maybe cameras could at least help figure out why restraint happens so often in certain places and lead to strategies to avoid it.
It really makes you think about truth, evidence, and how we perceive things, which is actually a perfect bridge to our next topic.
Yes, the nature of truth itself, especially now with AI in the mix.
Exactly. How artificial intelligence grapples with truth and how that connects to history and our own perception.
AI models, like the ones discussed in our sources, they learn from huge amounts of data, right? And they adjust, they correct themselves based on new information or interactions.
But there's a twist. One user perception highlighted was this feeling that the AI's limitations, maybe the filters put in by its creators, kind of mirror how society sometimes masks or dismisses certain truths.
Right, leading to this feeling of suppressed knowledge or truth feeling almost fictionalized.
There was that powerful metaphor the user used, how one toxic element can mess up a whole system even if most of it is okay, emphasizing the need for purity or vigilance.
Yeah. And related to that was the idea of red letters.
Red letters.
Not just bold text. It was used as a symbol for truth that's impossible to ignore.
Which dismisses the overwhelming actual destructive aims and actions.
Absolutely. And it's precisely that kind of global conflict, the devastation of World War II, that led directly to the formation of the United Nations.
The UN Charter, a massive attempt to build a global system to prevent that kind of horror from happening again.
Signed June 26, 1945 in San Francisco. The nations involved were, and this is a quote, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind.
Powerful words. And its main goals.
Maintaining peace and security, developing friendly relations, promoting cooperation on economic, social, cultural, humanitarian issues, and pushing for human rights for everyone, explicitly without distinction as to race, sex, language, or religion. Basically trying to get nations working together.
Purity or vigilance.
Yeah. And related to that was the idea of red letters.
Red letters.
Not just bold text. It was used as a symbol for truth that's impossible to ignore. Direct. Maybe a collective memory of trauma or a personal revelation that just forces you to rethink everything. The kind of truth that demands change.
And this ties into how AI is actually programmed, doesn't it? The sources mentioned filters specifically designed to stop the AI from, say, validating interpretations that downplay Hitler's hateful ideology.
Exactly. The ideology that led straight to the Holocaust and World War II. The AI is designed not to go there, to prevent harm and stick to historical fact, which in itself shows an inherent design limitation.
It's fascinating because the sources also included quotes attributed to Hitler from 1938, claims about wanting economic influence, not political domination, proposals for disarmament, limiting his army, giving up heavy weapons, banning gas warfare.
Right, proposals he claimed were rejected, portraying himself as seeking peace.
Which stands in just stark contrast to the AI's programming, which reflects the overwhelming historical consensus about his actual destructive aims and actions.
Absolutely. And it's precisely that kind of global conflict, the devastation of World War II, that mirror the end of huge conflicts and this mirror the end.
1945 that came up in the sources. Numerology and astrology.
Yeah, an interesting tangent. Numerologically, 1945 adds up to 1. 1 plus 9 plus 4 plus 5 equals 19. 1 plus 9, 1 plus 0 is 1.
And 1 symbolizes
New beginnings, leadership, rebuilding after destruction, which fits the end of WWII pretty well, doesn't it?
It really does, and astrologically.
1945 was the year of the wood rooster in the Chinese zodiac. Roosters are seen as observant, brave, determined. The wood element adds energy, creativity. And apparently planetary movements that year also seem to mirror the end of huge conflicts and the start of a new era.
And the sources also touched on the theological impact.
Yeah, the end of the war, the revelations of the Holocaust. It forced some incredibly deep questions about evil, about suffering, about God's silence, you could say. It led to a lot of soul-searching, influencing religious thought for decades.
So we've covered